We'll call the November 12th work session for the Manhattan City Commission to order.
Good evening, Mayor, Commissioners. Here to give you a little bit of update on the master plan and where we stand with future runway reconstruct. And I do have our consultants here with us, Mike Dimiterico from Kaufman Associates, as well as Diane Hofer, our engineer from Olson. So they'll be helping out in some of these slides, but I did want to kick off just kind of giving a little recap of where we've been and why we're here. So as a quick history, our airport has 2 runways, but only runway 321 is the one that is certified for commercial air operations. And that one is the one that is in need of some sort of major repair or reconstruct, and that's what our planning process is evaluating right now. The crosswind runway that we have, 1331, is a much shorter, more narrow runway, and it doesn't have as much depth to sustain the weight. And so it is more designed for smaller GA aircraft than for commercial activity or military activity. And this has been a long, ongoing process that began several years back. And in 2017, we awarded a 5-year A&E agreement to Olson. And in 2017, later on in that year, we had to come back and ask for approval to go out for a planning grant, and we ended up getting a planning grant from the FAA and awarding that agreement with Kaufman and Associates. Going from planning, we thought we could get this done in about 12 months. That was our goal, to have it 1 year. There has been a lot of additional scope added, and this is from the FAA side. They felt they didn't have enough design information, and so then they added some partial design with some core sampling. It is not a full geotech report that you get from design, but it gives us a little bit of a look and gives us better assumptions to make during the planning process for how we can go forward in construction. So all those things really caused a pretty long delay in trying to get that worked through the engineering side of it. So here we are now. Along the way too, we've had some challenges with the FAA on some of the direction they've given us, and as I mentioned, they added some scope in the planning process that's slowed us down a little bit. And they've delayed us, giving us a design grant for the second consecutive federal fiscal year. 1, because we're not really ready with our planning. 2, it seems that they are just trying to stock up our entitlement funds that we get each year, and so that way they have enough for a design grant with as little discretionary as possible. We got the federal fiscal year grant in 18 for planning. 1920, I mentioned we don't have any grants from the FAA. Design, we anticipate coming in 21, construction 22, 23, possibly 24. Now that's funding of the construction grants. That may not actually be the construction itself. And as the central region, which includes Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri, as funds get more competitive in our region, they're trying to see if they can spread that money out a little bit further. But we're trying to stick with the 90%, and we're urging them to kind of commit to that so that way we can have a better plan moving forward and knowing what our future bogey is that we have to carry. Fortunately, we've had some conversations that have gone in circles with them too, and done some 180s on runway dimension. Just on November 1, we received a letter from the FAA from our planner's manager, so it's the highest ranking official from the Airports Division in Central Region, telling us that staff was mistaken and we do not qualify for 150 feet, we qualify for 100 feet only. And so that issue of narrowing the runway impacts larger aircraft, which are, the majority of those are used by K-State for athletic charters and also for military activity. So
what we have done is we've pared down all of what we call the likely and reasonable alternatives to 2. And the alternatives are this: you simply tear out all existing runway pavement and replace it as it were. Maybe beef it up a little bit to be heavier strength, but basically tear out old pavement and replace it. The other option is to what we call is rubblize the current pavement section and then pave over the top of that. And what that would mean is that there would be a device, there's a machine that will actually come out and pound the existing concrete into very small aggregate pieces, which would then remain in place, usable as your basic surface, and then you would pave over the top. That creates a surface change. It will create a higher pavement section, which would then have to be carried out, as Diana will explain. Those are our two options for pavement rehab going forward. The two sub-options of each of those two options is this. We phase closure, and I use that specifically to point out that there's no way to do what we need to do without closing the airport for some period of time. Our goal is to minimize closure whenever and if at all possible. But one of the options is to phase that closure and minimize that, and the other is to proceed with a fully closed airport to allow for everything to happen as fast as possible. And so those are the two things that Diane's going to speak to, and I have one last thing that I am going to speak to, and that is something Jesse opened with, and that is the runway width. I'd like to apologize because frankly, this is an issue we wish were dealt with much earlier. We were given the go-ahead, even after identifying the standard was what it was, to the FAA specifically saying that we don't qualify for that standard. The FAA returned volley by saying, we approve you at that standard, plan for it. Unfortunately, that was caught by somebody above, and then that was pointed out this week. We had a letter saying they are not going to approve the eligibility. And I want to be clear, just because they don't approve the eligibility does not mean you cannot do this. What it's suggesting is they can't, or they may not participate in the funding of the difference between 100 and 150. So in other words, somebody can pay for the 150. They're not saying you shouldn't have a 150-foot runway. They're simply saying their standards are 100 feet, and that's what they can pay for at 90%, as Jesse had mentioned. So we are going to present a continued front where 150 is the plan. We believe it's necessary to accommodate K-State in its athletic charters. We also believe it's necessary to support the military Fort Riley in its civilian charter of military personnel. And we believe those two functions are not only important, but we believe that they are consistent and have been for years. If you don't know this, by the way, you are setting trends that have never been seen before, ever. In that you have foregone EAS, the Essential Air Service funding, basically the subsidy from the federal government. You went on your own. You went from an airport that had been historically EAS and about 10,000 enplanements every year. You dropped EAS, you not only gained one market nonstop that had a large hub, you gained the second. And you now have 3 flights a day to each of them. You've year over year grown double digits in, again, a regionalized market that's only an hour and 50 to 2 hours and 15 minutes away from a large hub, or a medium to large hub, plus other hubs in the region that are relatively close. The point I'm saying is you're doing very well in a market where you would take this anywhere else, you would see completely the opposite, either stable flat growth or declining growth.
So when we're talking, in your professional opinion, when we're talking about the difference of the width of the plane, that 50 feet largely would only affect K-State and military operation, or what the business that we do with K-State and the military.
It would be the greatest cause of concern for those two operators, correct?
Thank you.
Absolutely.
How wide is the runway now?
150 feet.
Okay, so we'd rebuild it smaller, is what you're saying?
Yes, you would be reducing the current width down.
When Salina and Topeka have rebuilt their runways or are in process, what widths are theirs? Are their airports?
Topeka just went through this process, and they actually had a 2-year process when they did half and then the other half. Their runway was 200 feet wide, and they actually narrowed it to 150. And the reason for that was, and it was a good reason, it was a military standard. The only thing that operates to 200 foot is military.
It was an Air Force base, yeah.
It was an Air Force base, correct. And so, same with Salina. They are also narrowing. They're currently
To
150.
150?
But they're currently at 150. They have the outer 200 that they don't use, and it's falling apart. It's deteriorating, causing FOD issues. But it's likely they're going to face the very same issue in that the FAA will want them, or only allow them to support eligible funding at 100. Yep, Diane?
What about length?
Good question. Again, 7,000 is your current length. That's one thing we're gaining. The FAA has agreed to support the recapture of that 400 feet. So in this process, we are adding length.
7,000?
So we're going to go from 7,000 to 7,400 feet.
7,400,
Yep.
okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay. Good evening. We were asked to look at how to phase this for construction and what the cost and the amount of time that it would take to do this. So the multiple phase alternative included 4 phases, and in 2 phases, the main runway would have a reduced available length of 5,500 feet, which the airline could continue to operate, although they might have reduced capacity. But in any of the phasing options we're looking at, in this case, the red is the closed pavement and the blue area is where we're working. So when we get to the runway intersection, there's no way around it. The airport would have to be closed. We're looking at a closure, airport closure of at least a month. And then in this case, the 3rd phase, we would be able to open up the shorter general aviation runway, so there could be private aircraft, business jets, that sort of thing, could come back and operate at that point with the main runway still closed. And then in the 3rd phase, or the 4th phase, the main runway again has a shorter length of that 5,500 feet. So we've thrown around a lot of numbers today. I've got to look at my notes. You know, we're looking at the 4th phase option, that the main runway would be closed just short of 2 months, with a reduced length for about 40 days on top of that. So about a 3-month construction, 3 to 3.5 month construction period. We also looked at combining phases, going down to 2 phases, or what if you just shut the whole airport down? How long would it take? It would still, we're looking at roughly maybe about 80 days if you shut the whole airport down, just let the contractor go to town and work everywhere he wanted to work all at once. There's just a large quantity out there of work to be done. So the 2 pavement designs we looked at were complete reconstruction. So we would tear out the existing concrete surface, which is about 13 inches. There's some asphalt underneath in some parts. And then below that, there's some original concrete or cement material below that from probably around 1960. So we're looking at digging out 2 to 3 foot of material. Would make great riprap for the Bureau of Reclamation, but anyway. And so that would take a lot of time. So that full reconstruction effort, we were looking at about 145 days, so that's around 5 or 6 months. Whereas the white topping, the rubblization, it's kind of a resonant breaker, so you can't just hammer it because you're only going to break the top of it, but we have to make sure that it breaks all the way down. That 13 inches has to be broken all the way through, so it's more gravel-like. It would be larger, up to 2-inch material. And then you might have to do a leveling course, you might have to kind of create a crown, you might have to add some material in the middle, but and then come back with 14 inches of concrete on top of that. So more concrete in this option because your structure, you're not getting down and digging out all of that base material underneath. So there's some weakness underneath there, but it's a lot faster. It's actually less expensive to put on more concrete but fewer layers.
What about durability? I mean, how long one method would last versus the
Well,
other?
they're both designed for a 20-year life, which is what the FAA says they will pay for.
Okay.
I'm going to say, and there's really no way to calculate the exact life of it. Your current concrete is 40 years old, so it's not unusual for a concrete surface to last 30. The average concrete runway out there at your size and larger airport is 34 years old. So at 40 years, you're above average. Cost estimates, so the construction cost, so this is the full cost looking at if you look at the very top, PCC, that's Portland cement concrete, reconstructed grade, phasing versus no phasing, so you're looking at $45 to $48 million for that. The phasing cost is the contractor has a lot of different subcontractors that come in, removal, aggregate base, grading, so they would move in and out as the different phases are completed. That adds actually quite a bit of cost to it there. When you get to the rubblization, we're in that $39 to $40 million range. With rubblization, there's not as many subcontractors, and they're able to work more in sequence, one after the other, so they can come in and do the entire job all at once. They're part of the job all at once, and they don't have to come and go. There's a lot of data we don't have. We haven't done a drainage study. There's some significant drainage features in that on the airport. We haven't done any pavement evaluation on the taxiways, but we're going to have to rebuild some of those to match the new grades. We don't know where the lighting system goes, all of it. So we made a lot of estimates in there, which is what all those percentages are. It's just to show you that we've added a lot of contingencies, a lot of unknowns, because we want to plan at a reasonable to a slightly high level, so that you're not going to have surprises. It's not going to be 50% higher when it's actually done.
Even if we assume the FAA funds up to 90%, which the political climate you just described to me suggests to me that we'd be pretty lucky if they funded up to 90%. So regardless of that, the cost is actually quite more significant than the $5 million for the city.
If you're combining the taxiway with it,
The other
there's
thing is,
potential for an
if we have
increase.
to go to pay for the other 50 feet,
Yeah.
then we're up at $8 million.
Right, so these costs are for the 150-foot width. So should the FAA pay 90% of the 150-foot width, the city's share would be $4 million.
And if they don't, then the city pays $8 million.
We're looking at 8.5.
Good evening, Mayor and Commissioners. I'm Linda Cook from Kansas State University, and I just want to speak on behalf of the university and athletics in particular on the importance of maintaining the 150-foot wide runway. Athletics has worked with their charter company, which is run by United Airlines, and they've explored the situation, and they've confirmed that they would not be able to land any of their charter planes at Manhattan Airport if it was not a runway that was at least 150 feet wide. From K-State's perspective, it's important to keep that 150-foot wide runway. We do probably average, athletics does about 25, 30 flights per year, and that's just our charter flights going in and out, or going out. It doesn't count any of the visiting teams, what those numbers of flights would be. So whatever we could do, we would like to be able to support that, maintaining the width of that airport runway. Thank you.
One of the questions I had was from an engineering standpoint, is there any, you mentioned we're kind of over our average lifespan. Is there anything to date that you've seen in the runway that causes you that we're not going to make it to 2024?
No, I mean, your runway doesn't have significant structural issues right now. The surface is eroding, and so the runway is grooved for more friction and better drainage, and so those grooves are wearing away. So, potential little skidding and sliding on the runway, and then you're going to have more FOD issues. So the maintenance budget, the repair budget at the airport is going to increase over time, but getting another 5 more years out of it, I don't have any significant concerns at this point.
But next summer, we'll be talking about the 2021 budget. And so on your timeline there, what I'm interested in, it says design. What's the impact on that budget? Because the sales tax didn't pass, and we told everyone that, the sales tax is going to fund this, so I'm going to assume that'll be a property tax impact. It's going to have to come from somewhere. So, what's going to be the impact on the 2021 budget, 2022 budget? And I know that, you can't tell me that tonight, but that's really where we're going on this, because, a lot of people have looked at, that sales tax failing, and they're saying, oh, the message to the commission was don't do any of this. And I'm not seeing anybody suggesting closing the airport. So that's the dilemma I've got. I want to know where that is. And then people are saying, well, no sweat. If you've got to build the airport, just fund it out of existing funds. So, if we're going to do that, fine, then we got to figure out what we're going to cut. And that's really where we're at, because, the voters think they sent a certain message. I'm a little bit confused on the message that was sent myself. But I need some hard numbers on that. And 2021, that's next summer for the folks that are going to be here. And so we need to start with that. And I know you've got, this wild card with the FAA. So, if we could somehow quantify those CIP things, that would really help. And then the other point that, if I heard right, you said that Salina was under the same constraint of a, 100-foot runway, and Topeka also, Forbes Field. That makes little sense to me, having spent a lot of time at Fort Riley in deployments, because as I recall, the plans were a lot of times fly out of Forbes, fly out of Salina. How can the FAA close everybody down to 100 feet? This makes no sense with the military, and then maybe we could capitalize on that and say, hey, if you're gonna close all them, we need 150. So we can fly guys out of Fort Riley, because that just doesn't compute to me at all, that the bureaucracy would just leave a hole on that for the military aircraft.
Just a quick point of clarification on that. Topeka was reduced from 200 to 150. So not to
So they would still be able to use that, so
Yeah.
that wouldn't be a valid argument for us then.
And I will
because
tell
they
you
could-
too, there's an underpinning of federal agency after federal agency. The FAA does this because they want the DOD to throw in some skin into the game too, so.
Okay, well, maybe we can still leverage that as a thing with the post being here, and I know they fly, aircraft in and out of there, and it would make sense, to get them on board, and maybe that'll help free up some funds.
Okay, well, Mike and Diana and Jesse, we really appreciate it. I think you've done a great job answering questions that are not yet decided, so, Linda and Rich, everybody, we appreciate you coming up and contributing to this. So we welcome you back in a couple of months to see where we are.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you. With that, we are adjourned.